Messianic Aryan Radio. Only one God.
Good morning. This is Elisel Rodriguez, and this is the Aryan Orthodox Church. And today we are going to be we're going to continue talking about Alan, the book, The Two Powers in Heaven by Alan Siegel. And so what we're learning from this book is the Jewish understanding, or the Jewish conflicts with Aryan Judaism, that, or Messianic Aryan Judaism, if you want to call it that. Actually, it's just traditional or Jewish understanding, but saying it in an Aryan way with Messianic flavor, because they believe in Jesus. That the Jews are dealing with a sect, the Christian sect, that is still part of Judaism, that is talking about Jesus being a separate being and Jesus being a second power, and how Jesus is, how the Memra, or the messenger of the Lord, or the word of the Lord, is Jesus, and how the Jews and the rabbis are trying to deal with this problem now. And so what I'm doing with that is showing you that Arianism, the church was Arian, even the Jewish church was Arian, and they understood that God the Father was the only God, and Jesus was a divine being, but not the Most High. And so the book, Two Powers in Heaven, is an attempt by Jews to understand what the rabbis were dealing with and try to explain what group it was, whether it's the Gnostics or whether it's just a faction within Judaism, whether it's Christianity and Judaism, or what was it, and trying to understand what the quandary was and why it was part of Jewish problems, rabbinical problems of the day. And so my point is to teach to you that that's Arianism, and that what they're describing is Arianism, and that therefore teaches that the early church was Arian, and believing in the Most High God, and then having Jesus as another God, but not the Most High. So here he says, on page 16 of The Two Powers in Heaven, the name of God as an angelic being, or a messenger being. So it says, quote, in a tact which anticipates some of the conclusions of this essay, he sees a relationship between two powers, heresy, and mystical traditions of the Merkabah type, which hypostasize the name of God as a separate angelic being, or a messenger being. At the same time, he sees a greater relationship than commonly recognized between those Jewish mystical traditions and Christian or apocalyptic works on the one hand, and agnostic works on another. So what's being said here is that he understands that the two powers doctrine that they're dealing with, which is Arianism, which is Christians, Jewish Messianic Jews who have the Arian doctrine, that the rabbis were dealing with in their synagogues, were saying that what they were saying about two powers, about the Father and the Son being separate divine beings, was actually consistent with their own theology of the Merkabah type. And Merkabah is a mysticism of Jewish mysticism, relationships to the Kabbalah, and so on. But that the name of God to them, that the name of God was a person. So that when you saw the name of God, that it was not necessarily God himself, but that it was an angelic person. And it's very interesting that they're saying that they would say that this being, who is Yahweh, essentially, or when the word name of God, the name of God is being introduced, that it's a separate being than God. And so that kind of goes into what we're talking about in Arianism, where in Arianism we understand that Jesus has been given the name above all names, and that not every time that you see in the Bible that it says Yahweh is it the Father. And so, and we just have to look back at the verse we saw yesterday with Genesis chapter 19, verse 24, that says the Lord on the earth call down fire in heaven from the Lord out of heaven on Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you see the two Yahwehs there. And when God says to Moses, come up to Yahweh. Not come up to me, but come up to Yahweh, as though it's a different person. These are the things that the Jews saw. They saw it way before we did. They understood that there was a difference, and they understood that as a messenger or representative of God, it's a separate being, though. And so that's the understanding that even in Merkabah, understanding mysticism, in which we don't follow that mysticism, but it was consistent with their understanding of the mysticism and the duality that they were dealing with, which was more extreme because a name was being given to it, and that was Jesus. And so we see that they were dealing with this quandary that the Messianic Jews who had Arianism were teaching, that all of these Jewish teachings of the Merkabah type and the Memra and the Word of the Lord and the Shekinah and this Merkabah type, where the Word of the Lord or the name of God is actually a person and not necessarily just a name, is developing. And it has consistencies in Arianism. And that's why they were having a problem. If it wasn't identical to what the Jews believed, then it wouldn't be a problem. They're like, oh, we've never believed that before. But because it was in Judaism, and it was consistent with their mysticisms and their already notions of God and messengers of God and representatives of God, it was consistent. It all fit together, and they were having problems now having to sparse even finally the understanding. So on page 21 it says, although the Dead Sea sectarians seemed to be dualists, they also believed in one transcendent God above all angels. For them, each of the moral forces, good and evil, had a captain. The angel of darkness and the angel of truth would correspond to the spirit of light and the spirit of darkness. And so the Dead Sea sectarians, who were not part of the regular Christian society, the Jewish society, were the ones that were outside, and it's possible that John the Baptist might have been in those kinds of sectarian groups for divinities there. But the problem was that one was the transcendent God and the rest were not the transcendent God, although they were considered dualists. The point we're coming to is that there was this belief system in Judaism that and in Christianity, in Jewish Christianity, that developed out from this, and that it was Jesus' identity. So on page 23 and 24, we read, since the Christian Messiah may have been a target of the two powers polemic, other mediating or intermediary divine helpers in Jewish tradition may have offended rabbinic sensibilities. The Aramaic terms Yikra, Memra, and Shekinah could be included in the heresy to the extent that they were not verbal subterfuges and point to a metaphysical or theological conception. However, it seems likely that these traditions represent rabbinic attempts to explain dangerous scripture rather than heresy itself. So let's go back. And this is not the end of the quote here, but what I'm wanting to point at is that they're saying that the Christian Messiah and the two powers doctrine are synonymous. So the Christian idea of Jesus being the second power and God being the higher, the only true God, is consistent with what they were dealing with. And then it says, and we'll reread this first paragraph. It says, since the Christian Messiah may have been a target of the two powers polemic, other mediating and intermediary divine helpers in Jewish tradition may also have offended rabbinic sensibilities. So now it's saying that yes, the Messiah was one of those problems that could be the two powers doctrine that they're fighting against, but also the normal Jewish traditions of the Yikra, the Memra, and the Shekinah are also issues that they're dealing with because they're already part of the tradition. So So what's already in the tradition of the Jews, as far as the doctrine of the Yikra, the Memra, and the Shekinah, all have this ability of being seen as having this second divine being used by God to represent God. And it's consistent with Christianity and the Messianic Christianity and the understanding in Christianity that Jesus was that Memra, was the Yikra, was the Shekinah of God. And so when you see that the Jews are having an issue with this, and you see that they're saying, well, it also has a problem with they're trying to add him as the Yikra, the Memra, the Shekinah. You see that they're having a problem because they're trying to deal with Christianity and Arian Christianity, where they say there's two powers essentially, that God is using another divine being to represent himself, and they put a name on it, and a human that they killed. They're having a problem with that because they do have these traditions of the Yikra, the Memra. And to look up the word Yikra, it's Yeqara, and Memra is Memra, and Shekinah is Shekhinah, for those of you who want to look further. So let's read the rest of the paragraphs here. Next paragraph says, in view of their lack of other evidence and because of his obvious genius, Philo has long been held to be the example par excellence of Hellenistic Judaism of the first century. His use of the term logos points to Jewish familiarity with Hellenistic philosophical schools. Philo's concept of the logo is a combination of Platonic ideas of divine intermediation and the Stoic world spirit. Logos is equivalent with the intelligible world because it can be hypostasized. The Logos can also be viewed as a separate agent and called God. Hence, any Jew who shared Philo's ideas of the nature of divinity could be a prime candidate for the charge of the two powers in heaven doctrine. Philo writes about the providence of God in another way as well, in terms of his powers summarizing by the creative and ruling power. We shall see that these traditions may also have some bearing on the problem of the two powers in heaven. Many scholars have pointed out that Philo's concept of logos is intimately related with other Hellenistic Jewish traditions about the figure of wisdom, the name of God, and the great archangel that mediated the Sinai theophany. It is possible that underlying Philo's philosophical language are exegetical traditions which he shares with many other Jews. And there's another paragraph here, but I need to see what time it is. Okay, so at the moment we're going to stop here. And so what he's saying is that Philo is an example of Hellenistic Judaism of the day, that he had the Logos doctrine, and that the Logos doctrine that he had, even in Judaism, if the rabbis, the later rabbis, looked at Philo and would have said, hey, this guy is a two powers heretic also, because it's so identical to Arianism, it's so identical to the Messianic Christians that were preaching Arianism at the time and giving the rabbis trouble because the rabbis already had traditions that Philo was expounding on, and because of that they were having problems. And they're saying that the later rabbis, the rabbis that existed after the life of Philo, are now becoming even troubled with his writings and the Hellenistic Judeo traditions and the mysticisms and the understanding of the Yikra and the Memra and the Shekinah and the great messenger of the Lord and all of these figures in Judaism and how they understand it. They're starting to push against that and even rejecting their own old traditions, because the traditions, the arguments being given by the Jewish Arian Christians are making an effect and are hard to discount. And because of that, they're pushing away from them and they're having a problem with it. So they're questioning whether they should even have the Yikra, the Memra, the Shekinah doctrine any further because of that. And so they're trying to find a way to push away. What we're seeing is how the Jews are trying to eliminate Christianity from Judaism and separate it from themselves. And ultimately they had to change their traditional doctrines to do that. And so they left the tradition and the great understanding that they had before to reject